Good afternoon, everyone. And the first item of business this afternoon is portfolio questions. Question 1 from Neil Bibby, please.
To ask the Scottish Government what so-called red lines an independent Scotland would set when negotiating membership of the EU.
Secretary Fiona Hislop.
As set out in Scotland's Future, the Scottish Government will approach EU membership negotiations on the principle of continuity of effect. That is a transition to independent membership that is based on the EU treaty obligations and provisions that currently apply to Scotland under our present status as part of the UK, and without a disruption to Scotland's current fully integrated standing within the legal, economic, institutional, political and social framework of the EU.
Thank you. Neil Bibby.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government have said this would be a matter for negotiation. I asked what the red lines for the Scottish Government would be, and that simply wasn't answered. I'll try again. The Euro, Schengen, the UK rebate, cap reform, our UK fees, are any of them red lines? Is a derogation from the EU directive on banking headquarters a red line? Or am I to assume that by not telling me what the red lines would be, the SNP Government have no red lines on EU membership and would be content to join the EU at any cost?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would recommend that the member not only reads Scotland's Future, but also reads Scotland and the EU, which is another paper that was issued at the same time. And had he read those papers, I think he would be better informed. And I think people 6 months ago to the referendum not only expect information and explanation from this government, they kind of expect a better informed opposition and a no position.
Many thanks. Annabel Goldie.
If Scotland votes for independence, how will the Scottish Government deal with requirements from Eastern European EU member states that any admission by Scotland to the EU is conditional upon transitional measures extending up to and beyond 10 years? Will the Scottish Government refuse any such transitional conditions, or what is the maximum period it will accept for them?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm sure the member has also read the material I've just referred to, but also would understand that an analysis that is talking about Scotland as an accession state is not what is presented in the White Paper, Scotland's Future. Indeed, if you look at the evidence that's currently being given to the European and External Affairs Committee, she'll recognise a significant support from well-informed and experienced contributors to that evidence session. The Article 48 using variation of treaties from within continued membership is completely different. And does she also acknowledge that there is not one member of the EU that has said that Scotland would not be part and a continuing member of the EU?
George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the Cabinet Secretary share my disappointment that the Labour Party in Westminster is currently doing the political hokey-cokey with supporting an in or out referendum on EU membership? And does she agree with me that the only way to secure Scotland's place in the European Union is with a yes vote?
Yeah. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I do. Indeed, I think there will be many people on the Labour benches who would be very uncomfortable with their position and stance as being driven in reaction to an anti-EU party which loses its deposit in Scotland. And in terms of the position of the UK Government, even the Secretary of State for Scotland acknowledged on the Sunday Politics, the 24th of November last year, when he said that he didn't, and I quote, think anybody can give any guarantee that the UK would still be in the EU by the end of this decade.
Finally, Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would go back, however, Presiding Officer, to Mr Bibby's question about red lines. A few weeks ago in this chamber, Ms Sturgeon seemed to indicate that there was indeed at least one red line that would be a line too far for the Scottish Government. Does Ms Hislop agree with that particular position, and would she like to restate it today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm sure the member is aware that there are 11 countries within the EU who do not use the EU. There is also the euro in relation to the preconditions that a member state must meet before being permitted to the eurozone. There are 5 economic preconditions, including voluntary participation in the ERM for at least 2 years, and none of those are legally binding on a member state. So therefore, in terms of understanding and being informed on this issue, it is quite clear that you cannot legally oblige a member state to adopt the euro as its current state in the first place.
Many thanks. Question 2 has not been lodged in the name of Fiona Hislop for understandable reasons. Question 3, Rhoda Grant.
And thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what European funding streams are available to help safeguard the cultural heritage of communities.
Cabinet Secretary.
A wide range of European funding streams is available, many of which could provide funding to safeguard the cultural heritage of communities. For example, in the Members' Highland and Islands region, the Creative Industries and Media Centre in Stornoway has received over £1 million of ERDF funding, while the Skara, Bray and Urquhart Castle visitor centres have received £316,000 and £893,000 respectively in recent years, also from ERDF, and the Applecross Landscape Partnership Scheme has received £94,000 from the LEADER programme under European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that response. I've written to her previously about the precious archaeology in the Western Isles that is being lost due to coastal erosion. I stood recently in a Neolithic house which was appearing out of the side of a sand dune. The other half of it was already strewn on the beach below, lost for future generations. Will she seek to access funding from the European Union or indeed other sources to protect this archaeology before much of it is lost forever?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, there are some challenges in terms of how the focus of European funds are going forward to Europe 2020 in terms of accessibility, but I do acknowledge that there is such a challenge in terms of the archaeology and coastal erosion. You see that not just in the Western Isles but elsewhere in Scotland. So trying to identify opportunities for European funding, indeed probably the best aspects are those of combined activity across a number of countries, and indeed we're looking already in discussions with Ireland, for example, on how we can take that forward, and that's obviously one of the best ways to access European money is in relation to cooperation with other countries, and we're in active discussions, for example, with Ireland.
Excellent. Question 4, Patricia Ferguson.
To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with Scottish Enterprise regarding the establishment of a film studio in Glasgow.
Cabinet Secretary.
On Friday, a report by Eccles Consultants was published. This was commissioned by Scottish Enterprise in partnership with Creative Scotland and the Scottish Government, who have been monitoring this through the Delivery Group for Film and Television that I established last year. The ECOS report indicates that tax incentives have created a surge of interest in filming in Scotland, and this is driving demand for studio space. The report assesses several potential options and recommends that representatives of the private sector be invited to submit their own development briefs for a studio facility. If this request for proposal fails to identify a suitable commercial project, the report recommends that public sector agencies should concurrently proceed with a detailed appraisal and business plan for a foundation studio.
Patricia Ferguson.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. As she knows, Glasgow has recently had a number of very successful forays into the world of film production, and those are now being broadcast in our cinemas. That seems to me to demonstrate that there is huge demand for such a facility in Glasgow. Independent film producers have been crying out for it for a long time, and while the ECOS report is welcome, it doesn't actually tell us anything we didn't know. So while we've been waiting for the ECOS report to be published, we've had the spectacle of Northern Ireland and Wales becoming very seriously involved in this area. So isn't it time that we stopped talking about it and actually began to establish such a film studio, and in Glasgow?
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary.
The member is a former Culture Minister and had responsibility for establishing a studio or developing the film industry. Now, obviously, the market conditions have been challenging, not just in her period, but also at the start of our period in government. The conditions have now changed, and not least the tax incentives, welcome as they are, campaigned for by this government, but also in terms of the relationship and value between the dollar and the pound, which makes opportunities there. She's quite correct to identify successes. In September, we saw the premieres of 5 major films: Filth, Startup, Sunshine Lease, The Railman, Under the Skin, and Filth and Sunshine, the 2 biggest grossing UK made films in the UK on release. But I actually agree with her in terms of action, and that is why we are taking forward the recommendations in that report. It's why on the 26th of February, both John Swinney and I met with the Independent Producers Scotland, where a number of areas, not just a studio, but also other support for the film industry were discussed, and proactively will be taking that forward over the next period.
Many thanks. Colin Beattie.
Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm how much has been provided from the Scottish Public Sector Sources Purse to support the screen sector in the last 3 years?
Yes, total public sector support for the screen sector over the last 3 years was 19.7 million in 2010-11, 17.5 million in 2011-12 and 21 million in 2012-13. That makes £58.2 million over the course of the 3 years. It's important to recognise that sector, particularly to the economic growth of Scotland, but also in portrayal of Scotland, and also importantly in the cultural development of that Indigenous film industry.
Thanks. Question 5, Kezia Dugdale.
Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Sure the phones are off, please.
Do you ask the Scottish Government how it supports the College of Piping in the wider traditional music sector?
Secretary Fiona Hislop.
The Scottish Government supports the traditional music sector through Creative Scotland, which disburses nearly £2 million each year to organisations directly forming part of the sector. Creative Scotland's support for piping is mainly through the National Piping Centre. They have never received an application from the College of Piping, which is also based in Glasgow, for funding, although Creative Scotland have advised them that they have the same opportunity to apply for funding as anyone else. The College of Piping is not a statutory body and is not funded through the Scottish Funding Council, although it awards SQA recognised exams in tandem with the Piping and Drumming Qualifications Board.
Kezia Dugdale.
Can I thank the Minister for that answer? She'll be aware that the Scottish School Piping Championships were just a couple of weekends ago, and I'm sure she'd join me in congratulating all the winners of that contest. She might be aware, however, that in 3 of those categories, all of the winners were from private schools, and there's a real problem attracting state school kids to learn the pipes. I wonder if her government might consider a right to piping in schools, and whether she might discuss that matter with her education colleagues.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm a keen champion of piping. I've attended the Worlds in the last number of years. My father was a member of a pipe band, and I'm looking forward to welcoming the British Pipe Band Championships again to Bathgate in my constituency. But she's also quite right to note that we need to make sure there's accessibility more widely for piping and piping tuition. And I would like to give the example of Bogholm Bathgate, one of Scotland's premier pipe bands in my constituency, who have got an excellent relationship with young people from all schools, and I think it's also that community approach to piping and the dedication of the members, not only at the College of Piping but also at the National Piping Centre, to pass it on. But I certainly hear what she's saying, and I'll be more than happy to discuss that with my education colleagues.
Thank you. Mary Scanlon.
The choice and availability of bagpipes as a musical instrument in schools is variable, to say the least, and tuition costs range from £0 to over £250 a year, prohibitive for many families. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to look at a more consistent approach to piping in schools to provide opportunities for more pupils to pay the bagpipes and, as Kezia Dugdale said, more schools to form pipe bands?
Well, I'm certainly in favour of more piping in schools and more generally, but I think she raises an issue which cuts to this issue of to what extent can central government provide consistency across local authorities, and at what point we get the cries for independence for local authorities to make their own decisions. But as you'll have seen, my colleague Alistair Allen has been proactive in taking forward some of the issues about instrumental provision in schools, and it's something that we're keeping a very close eye on. But I do recognise the calls for recognition of piping, and I've seen magnificent piping in our schools, and I will always remember, particularly in Glasgow Academy, hearing the combination of the orchestra and the pipes in Highland Cathedral. We have many talented young pipers, but we need to make sure the pipeline of pipers can continue.
Question 6, Jimmy.
To ask the Scottish Government what representations it has made to the UK Government regarding the impact of the Syrian conflict on the Scottish Government's external affairs strategy.
Minister Humza Yousaf.
The Scottish Government's international framework sets out our strong and enduring commitment to securing democracy, the rule of law and fundamental human rights across the world. And keeping with that commitment, the First Minister wrote to the Foreign Secretary last September, the Prime Minister in January, about the situation in Syria, urging the UK Government to support the resettlement of those fleeing the conflict who are most in need, and stating, of course, that Scotland would play her part in providing a welcoming, safe home for Syrian refugees. This was reiterated in a letter from the First Minister to the Home Secretary on the 4th of March, and I'm pleased the UK Government have agreed to do so.
Thank you. Jim Eadie.
I thank the Minister for that answer. While the UK Government's provision of humanitarian assistance to Syria is to be welcomed, the UN High Commissioner has called on EU member states to provide shelter to 30,000 of the most vulnerable Syrian refugees. Germany has agreed to take 10,000 refugees, Sweden has accepted 25,000, while the UK has agreed to accept only 500 refugees. Does the Minister agree that the UK and Scotland should do more, much more, to assist people, men, women and children escaping the humanitarian crisis in Syria?
Minister.
I thank the member for the question. I think it's important to reiterate that the UK Government has played a leading role in terms of overseas aid and development to the Syrian crisis, over £650 million in terms of aid, and I think it's important to recognise that. I think it's also important to welcome the fact that the UK Government has agreed to take Syrian refugees. I think the number of refugees, as he iterates in his question, I think you look at this as hopefully a first step, something to build upon in the years to come, because the crisis is huge. It's 2.5 million people externally displaced, and more than the population of Scotland, 6 million people internally displaced. So the scale of the crisis is huge. We should welcome the fact that the UK Government has decided to play a part, and Scotland will also play a part in that. But we'd hope wherever the UK and wherever Scotland can play a further role, then of course we will encourage the UK Government to do that.
Thanks very much. Question 7, Chick Brodie.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with the Californian State Government and the Governor regarding how to ensure a lasting legacy from the Homecoming Scotland 2014 event, the John Muir Festival.
Minister Humza Yousaf.
The John Muir Festival is a signature event within the Homecoming 2014 programme of over 700 events taking place across every local authority area in Scotland. The legacy of the festival celebration of this great Scots life will be the opening of the spectacular Falkirk Kelpies in the John Muir Way, a new national pathway stretching 120 miles across central Scotland from Dunbar to Helensburgh. Scottish Natural Heritage has worked jointly with the US Park Service to produce detailed digital models of John Muir's birthplace, his home in Dunbar, and his family home in Martinez, California. We will use Scotland Week in the USA to take part in a tree planting ceremony in the Muir Woods on the edge of San Francisco to mark the creation of John Muir Way. Plans are also being drawn up for a meeting with government representatives during the visit, as well as with the Sierra Club representatives, who are keen to explore opportunities for the ongoing promotion of the way to their members across the United States.
Chick Brodie.
I thank the Minister for that very comprehensive answer. April sees the principal kick-off of the John Muir Festival, with the town of Dunbar, his birthplace, a focal point of that festival. On the back of that, will the Scottish Government seek to arrange and agree to establish further twinning arrangements with towns in California, such as we have the current arrangement between the towns of Dunbar and Martinez?
Minister.
I thank the member for the question. Twinning arrangements like the long-standing links between Dunbar and Martinez enrich communities across Scotland, fostering friendship and understanding between cultures, but also celebrating that important ancestral connection, like the global legacy of John Muir. The Scottish Government, of course, is keen to encourage meaningful twinning where that is appropriate, but of course we do not have a role in that locus. That is a matter for individual local authorities, but of course, in principle, where they are meaningful, we will, of course, in principle, be supportive.
Margaret Mitchell.
To ask the Scottish Government what it is doing to promote young people's interests and talents in culture and the arts.
Secretary.
In addition to all the cultural and artistic activity taking place in our schools and colleges, the Scottish Government is promoting young people's engagement with the arts and culture through Scotland's Youth Arts Strategy, Time to Shine, which I launched in November last year. Creative Scotland's Youth Arts Programme is taking shape, and the awarding of funding for regional youth arts hubs will be made shortly. Working with Young Scot, the Youth Arts National Advisory Group is being identified, and that should be in place by mid-May.
Cabinet Secretary, for that very comprehensive answer. Is she aware of the success of North Lanarkshire Council's Creative Residency Programme, established 9 years ago, which provides the opportunity for 50 school students to spend 1 week each year developing their artistic talents in a creative environment, and which has resulted in superb garments, painting and sculptures produced by the pupils being exhibited at Summerlee Museum in Coatbridge? And does she consider this type of programme should be available to more students and pupils throughout Scotland?
Say briefly, please.
I think that's a very good example of embedding arts and creativity in curriculum for excellence, and I'm sure it's something that we can make sure other local authorities are aware of, and I would look forward to learning more about that project in particular.
Many thanks. And we will now move to infrastructure, investment and cities questions. Question 1, Alec Johnston.
To ask the Scottish Government how many units have been completed under the National Housing Trust.
Thank you. Margaret Burgess, Minister, when you're ready, please.
Okay, thank you. The National Housing Trust Initiative, the first guarantee-based model for housing in the UK, is a major success. Deals for the delivery of over 1,600 homes across 10 local authority areas have already been signed, and more deals are expected to be signed shortly. 555 NHT homes are already complete.
Thank you. Alex Johnston.
The Minister will be aware that in spite of the existence of the National Housing Trust, there remains a number of potential investors, both in the private and institutional sector, who seek to work in partnership with local authorities in order to provide affordable housing. Will the Minister consider what can be done to escape the inflexibility of the National Housing Trust and begin to deliver the encouragement and support necessary to ensure that our local authorities take up this investment and begin to actually cut waiting lists?
Minister.
Yes. The National Housing Trust is a very popular way to build houses at no cost to the Scottish Government, and certainly is something that we will continue to do and continue to promote. It serves a very particular need in the areas that it's delivering in, and at the same time we continue to work, our Financial Innovation Unit continues to work with investors, discussing ways that we can go forward for major investment, as the member has talked about before, in terms of pension schemes and other types of investment in the housing sector. And we continue to do that, but we'll also continue to support and develop the National Housing Trust.
Thank you very much. Question 2, Hugh Henry.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will support improved transport links between Glasgow Airport and Glasgow City Centre.
Thank you. Minister Keith Brown.
The recent Glasgow Airport Strategic Transport Network study identified much that Glasgow City and Renfrewshire councils, working with Glasgow Airport, could do in the short term to improve bus services to and from the airport, and there are few risks to the implementation of those measures and much that can be achieved at a low cost. I have also asked Transport Scotland to work with Glasgow Airport and the councils in considering further the feasibility of a tram train link from Glasgow Airport to Glasgow Central Station.
Hugh Henry.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Will the Minister fully fund any suggested tram train link between Glasgow Airport and Glasgow City Centre, and if so, when? And will this involve the repurchase of land sold off when the previous plan was shelved?
Minister.
I think it's obvious from the statement that's already been made within the report, but also by the partners, that we're at a very early stage of this. What we've said is that we will initiate the work. We will look for contributions to the work that's required in order to make sure that we can do the feasibility and design work that's necessary to take this further forward. I should also make clear that we recognise, as does the report, there are risks inherent in this. It's not a straightforward thing to do, so we understand that point at this stage. That also means that there's not a fixed trajectory for that linkage yet. In fact, I think 3 are covered within the report, and that will tell us if there is further land to be acquired. I don't think from memory that they would require any buyback of any land previously disposed of. But again, we have to wait and see exactly what comes forward. But I would say that this should be considered alongside, of course, the other achievements, the M74, the M80, funding Fastlink and the Paisley Corridor improvements, which this Government has taken forward.
Many thanks. John Mason.
Thank you. I wonder if the Minister would agree that the previous Garrow scheme had the major disadvantage that it did not link into any local communities. And if he is looking at future options, could one of the options be a light rail link that went through Braehead and Renfrew, which would boost local communities and take people away from shopping centres and cars?
Well, I think the member mentions a very important point, which is this report vindicates the decision of the Scottish Government to cancel the GAR project based on the cost-benefit which would accrue from it. However, I would say that we would want to focus at this stage on further consideration of the proposals which have come forward in the report, to look at more detail as to how feasible the tram-train solution identified in the most recent study would be to deliver. That's our focus at this stage.
Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the Minister able to outline any discussions that he or his officials have had with Network Rail or the Office of Rail Regulation on the tram train system known as dual running and confirm the earliest possible opportunity that such a scheme could be approved?
Minister.
Well, it was obviously the case that the report, which has only just been published in the last week, that would have taken into account some of these factors. But those detailed discussions as to the implications are the next stage. That's what I'm saying that we are now ready to push forward on, in concert with our partners at Glasgow City Council, Renfrewshire Council and, of course, Glasgow Airport, whose study this was. So we will discuss these issues with them, and many of the issues which he mentions, or some of the issues which he mentions, will already have been considered in compiling the report.
Thank you. Annabel Goldie.
The history of this issue precedes by many years the arrival of the Minister in this Parliament, but I have painful recollections of ministerial rigidity, for which I cannot blame Mr Brown, excluding everything but an expensive heavy rail link. So, echoing Mr Mason, does the Minister agree that any consideration of improved transport links to Glasgow Airport would benefit from flexibility of approach and a range of options?
Minister.
I think the member is right. I think that's exactly what this report does. It does lay out other options, for example, personal rapid transport being one of the options, and also, as I've mentioned already, a number of bus improvements which could be done quite quickly, as well as the tram train link. We did say, though, at the start that having cancelled Garrel and having seen the cost-benefit of that we didn't want to fund, we would not fund a heavy rail option. That could still have come forward. Others may still want to progress with that, but we said for our part that we wouldn't fund that. But all the other options which have been proposed have been seriously considered, and I think a statement of our intent in that regard is our willingness to take forward the tram train option and look at it in much more detail.
Thanks. Question 3, Lewis MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government how it will support strategic infrastructure developments in the Aberdeen City region.
Cabinet Secretary Nicola Sturgeon.
We welcome Aberdeen City's strategic infrastructure plan, which was published in the autumn, and we expect to continue to support and indeed complement local and regional investment in Aberdeen that can unlock sustainable economic growth.
Mr MacDonald.
Thank you very much. While the latest national planning framework recognises that expanding Aberdeen Harbour is a national priority, including the roads infrastructure which will be required, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that connecting the new harbour facilities to the rail network could also create business and jobs, for example in commissioning offshore renewables and in decommissioning oil platforms? Will the Government undertake to work with Aberdeen Harbour Board and Network Rail and other interested parties to ensure that those opportunities are not missed?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would certainly agree with Lewis MacDonald that all of the specific issues he's mentioned are opportunities for Aberdeen if we get it right, and I'm certainly happy to give an undertaking that we will work with all stakeholders and agencies. He mentioned the Harbour Board, Network Rail, the City Council. We're keen to work collaboratively to make sure that we are making the strategic infrastructure investments that unlock that economic potential in Aberdeen. Aberdeen is one of the fastest growing parts of Scotland, but we need to make sure the infrastructure is facilitating the further economic success of the city. So we're happy to work with anybody, and as I said, we are supportive of the strategic infrastructure plan that the City Council has published, and look forward to working with them sort of together and directly, but also through the collaborative framework of the Cities Alliance to look at how we take these things forward.
Thank you. Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. One of the key infrastructure projects in the city is, of course, the improvements to the Haddington roundabout in my constituency. The Transport Minister joined me at a meeting with Middlefield residents on Monday evening to discuss the Scottish Government's plans, and residents were very welcoming of the certainty provided at that meeting. But what they want is for the politics to be left to the side and for the Scottish Government and the Council to work together to improve the area and deliver the project. Would the Cabinet Secretary join with me in calling on the Council administration to now join with the Scottish Government in that approach to ensure that this is delivered for the betterment of the city and also for the community?
I would strongly endorse Mark MacDonald's comments. I think it would be to the benefit of everybody in the city of Aberdeen if we left a lot more of the politics out of some of these really important discussions. We are all politicians, but we are all also public servants who are there to serve the needs of the people of Aberdeen. Mark MacDonald talks about the important investments that are required around the Haddington roundabout. Clearly, we are now in a position of moving forward with the Western Peripheral route after many years of delay that was not of this government's making, and it's important that that continues apace in order that we can then move on to deliver the important improvements around Haddington. For the part of this government, we are committed, as I indicated to Lewis MacDonald, to working with anybody, regardless of politics, to make sure that we are maximising the potential of the great city of Aberdeen, and I hope that we can all get together in that spirit to do exactly that.
Many thanks. Question 4, Roderick Campbell.
To ask the Scottish Government how many people in Fife have received support from the open market shared equity scheme since 2011.
Minister Margaret Burgess.
Between April 2011 and December 2013, 64 homes have been purchased through the open market shared equity scheme in Fife.
Thank you. Roderick Campbell.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Minister, I've been approached by constituents who are struggling to find a suitable property in their preferred area of Anstruther and believe the price thresholds are too restrictive. Can the Minister advise whether there are any plans to review the thresholds, particularly taking account of the fact that property prices in Fife are far from uniform?
Minister.
The threshold prices for the open market shared equity scheme are currently set at the lower quartile, which is the most commonly used measure for identifying affordable houses in the private sector. This allows us to help as many buyers as possible and to continue to target those people who need help to be able to access the affordable housing market. We will continue to keep the threshold prices under review. However, I would say to the member that the open market shared equity scheme is just one of a range of initiatives operating across Fife and Scotland to help buyers to access home ownership. And the Scottish Government's popular Help to Buy Scotland scheme currently has 51 developments across Fife that are registered to participate in the scheme. And the industry-led My New Home scheme, which is supported by a Scottish Government guarantee, is also helping home ownership in Fife.
Fife. Question from Mary Fee.
Can the Minister inform the Chamber how many people from council and RSL homes have been accepted for the scheme, and what further support will be given to target the scheme at those on low to medium incomes?
Don't have those figures in the Chamber, but I can certainly get those figures to the member. But we encourage the scheme is set for a particular group of people, and RSL tenants have moved from RSL lists into the open market shared equity scheme and to the NHT scheme after discussion and looking at their affordability. But certainly I'll see if those figures, I don't know if we keep those figures, but I will check that and let the member know.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Question 5, Bob Doris.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how the Scottish Welfare Fund supports vulnerable families in Glasgow and across the country.
Nicola Sturgeon.
Glasgow City Council has a budget of £7.7 million to deliver the Scottish Welfare Fund in its area. That represents 23% of the total £33 million fund. To the end of December, informal monitoring shows that Glasgow City Council had spent over £5.4 million on crisis grants and community care grants, and across the country local authorities have made grants worth around £18.5 million over the same period. In addition to help directly from the Scottish Welfare Fund, applicants can also be referred or signposted by local authorities for support from other agencies such as advocacy services, welfare rights, housing and money management organisations.
Thank you. Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My constituents in Glasgow who rely on the Scottish Welfare Fund for money, often due to draconian UK benefit cuts and sanctions, sometimes have a variety of other challenges and support needs, and I think the Cabinet Secretary alluded to that there. Can I ask for some more details about how the Scottish Government measures the successful outcomes for those receiving cash and other support from the Scottish Welfare Fund for those kind of softer level kinds of support, such as signposting for welfare rights and job-seeking skills and things of that nature?
Cabinet Secretary.
As Bob Doris will be aware, there's a variety of information about the operation of the Welfare Fund being collected and now being reported on a regular basis. We also appointed Harriet Watt last October to undertake an independent review of the operation of the new fund. We will expect to be in a position to publish the evaluation report in the spring, and that will help us to identify any changes before we put permanent arrangements on a legislative footing. And we, in the course of all of that evaluation and our regular reporting, the issue of the type of help that is being given to people is obviously very important. As Bob Doris will be well aware, local authorities are responsible for deciding how to make awards that best meet the needs of the applicant, whether that's cash, goods or indeed signposting, and they need to be able to use discretion. Final point, Presiding Officer, on the issue of sanctions. Clearly we have concern about the application of the sanctions regime, please, and we are in the process of changing the Welfare Fund guidance to local authorities to make it clear that help can be given to people in a crisis because of the application of sanctions.
Many thanks. Question 6, Dr Lane Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how many housing association new builds were completed in Dumfries and Galloway in 2013.
Minister Margaret Burgess.
During the calendar year 2013, there were 27 housing association new builds completed in Dumfries and Galloway. A further 659 approved units are expected to complete by March 2016. We also support affordable housing in the area through a range of national programmes, such as the National Housing Trust, Open Market Shared Equity and Help to Buy Scotland schemes.
Elaine Murray.
Thank you. Thank the Minister for that response. The Minister will probably be aware that the figure of 27 housing and new builds complete in 2013 is actually the lowest number since 1999. And in that year, only 47 house starts took place. That again was the lowest since 2010. And 38 were approved, the second lowest since 1999. So does the Minister agree that as there are over 5,000 households on the RSL waiting list in Dumfries and Galloway, action needs to be taken to increase the availability of social housing for rent in my constituency?
Margaret Burgess.
As the member says, at face value, the figure of 27 doesn't look that high, but the figures appear to suggest that that's the only completions and have declined significantly. But a number of factors have contributed to that, and that was for the calendar year. There's already been a further 44 completions already this year, with another 30 to come on hand, bringing a total of 101 to the end of this financial year. However, there's also a large contract, which I'm sure the member is aware of, in Dumfries and Galloway, of 312 units, and most of those are complete and tenants are in them. However, they don't record on the statistics until the full contract is complete, and that's why the figure may seem less than it is. But I can assure the member that we're still building more houses, socially rented houses in Dumfries and Galloway than was previously built under the previous administration, and certainly will continue to do that. House building in Scotland in social sector and in the RSL sector is higher since 2007 than it was in the previous administration, and we continue to go forward with our target, which we intend to meet.
Thank you. Question 7, Sarah Boyatt.
Ask the Scottish Government what contribution it considers housing can make to tackling poverty.
Mr. Margaret Burgess.
Okay, too many of Scotland's people still live in communities suffering the effects of deprivation and disadvantage. As outlined in the revised Child Poverty Strategy for Scotland, published on the 10th of March 2014, we intend to focus on area-based factors which currently exacerbate the effects of individual poverty for many families. Housing is a key part of our physical, economic and social fabric, and getting housing right will contribute significantly to our wider aims to tackle poverty and health inequalities and to build confidence and capacity in communities.
Thank you. Sarah Boyatt.
Can I thank the Minister for her reply and ask if she's seen the report on poverty that was presented to Edinburgh City Council last week, which identified the stark difference there is between the richest and the poorest areas in the city, and the fact that we now have 152 bids for every social rented property becoming available, with 25,000 people waiting on our housing lists? And will she say what she is doing to work with the City Council to help deliver the 16,000 affordable rented houses that the Council estimates are needed over the next decade? There has been a huge amount of social housing built in the early years of this Parliament, but I'm afraid, given the current austerity measures that our housing associations are experiencing and the lack of finance the Council has, we're not getting the rate of social housing starts that the City and its residents urgently need.
The Scottish Government understands the affordable housing issues in Edinburgh and has supported the City with significant levels of Scottish Government funding over the past few years. In the period 2012-13 to 2014-15, £81.168 million of Scottish Government grant funding managed through TMFD arrangement with City of Edinburgh Council has been made available and is expected to assist in the delivery of 1,469 affordable units. And we've just announced a further £88 million for the period to March 2019, and we continue to work with Edinburgh City Council to help them address the housing need in Edinburgh.
Briefly, Alex Johnston.
Could I ask what consideration the Minister has given to targeting future affordable housing investment in areas where there are the greatest job opportunities?
Minister, briefly.
As the member will be aware, it's the local authorities who determine the houses in their area, and we have an arrangement with them and with COSLA of how the affordable housing supply funding is distributed, and that arrangement is in place at the moment, and we continue with that arrangement, but we also continue to work with the councils in the areas of high demand for Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, where the job opportunities for people coming in, and we're working with them in many innovative ways of ensuring that they have a proper level of housing for all those that require it.
Thank you. That ends question time. The next item of business is election of a member for appointment to the Scottish Parliament Corporation.